This is the System M.Zuiko Pro 12-40mm F2.8 Mark II. So the original version of this lens was called the Olympus M.Zuiko Pro, but this is the Mark II, which is OM system. And it was announced in February 2022, but the Mark I version of this lens was announced in September 2013. So the improvements in the Mark II, which is this one that I have here, is mainly in the coating of the lens elements. So my takeaway from that is that if you have backlit situation or side light coming into the lens without using a lens hood, then this will protect you against that to a certain extent. And also there's less scattering of lights in between the lens elements. So even though lens elements let light through, they also reflect some of the light, and you'd have these lights bouncing between the lens elements, which degrade the image quality to a certain extent. So this lens should have improved that. So if you have a version 1 of this lens and a version 2, you can try that to take some pictures in backlit situations and then see the difference. This lens weighs 382 grams and is 8.4 centimeters when retracted, and is weather sealed to IP53 rating, and it has an electronic focus ring, or focus by wire as they call it, and it has a manual focus clutch. So if I pull the focus ring backwards, the lens will go into manual focus, and here you can see the distances, and I can pull focus manually. So once I pull back this manual focus clutch or focus ring, it stops taking orders from the camera for focusing. And then once you push it forward, then those connections between the camera and the lens are re-established, and the lens will essentially take orders from the camera again. So it's really easy to switch between autofocus and manual focus using the focus ring, or the manual focus clutch as they call it. It has a manual mechanical zoom ring, as you can see, and it also has a lens function button there. So inside the camera you can program what you want this lens function button to do. This lens has a lens hood, which is the OM System LH-66D. I don't know if you can see that in the video. And it has a front lens cap with the model number LC-62G. And the number 62 comes from the filter thread size of the lens, which is 62 millimeters. And the maximum aperture on this lens is f2.8, and that's a constant f2.8 across the full zoom range of the lens. And it has a minimum aperture of f22. It has 7 aperture blades, and it has a diagonal angle of view of 84 degrees at the widest and 30 degrees at the narrowest or telephoto end. The closest focusing distance is 20 centimeters, and that's 20 centimeters from the focal plane of the camera, or where the sensor is positioned, not 20 centimeters from the front of the lens. So in terms of disadvantages, this lens doesn't really have any disadvantages, but just so that you're aware of, it's relatively big and heavy in comparison to some of the other micro four thirds lenses. So it weighs 382 grams and is 8.4 centimeters when retracted. And there are other Olympus lenses that are 100 grams or 150 grams. So it is a little bit big and heavy, particularly if you're operating it handheld for extended periods of time. There are lighter options available, but you would compromise on some aspects like the aperture or the focal range or something. The main advantages of this lens is that it has a large aperture at f2.8, and the image quality of this lens is also really good, and that's across the full focal range. And it's also resilient to backlit situations, and it's weather sealed, and it has the manual focus clutch, which some people really like, and the lens function button. So it's a really good lens. So to compare this lens to other micro four thirds lenses, one comparison would be to the 12-45mm M.Zuiko Pro. So the Olympus M.Zuiko Pro 12-45mm f4 weighs 254 grams, whereas this one weighs 382 grams. So this one is lighter, and this one is 7 centimeters long, whereas this one is 8.4 centimeters. And this one is weather sealed to IPX1 rating, whereas this one is weather sealed to IP53 rating. So the 12-45 doesn't have a manual focus clutch, and it also doesn't have a lens function button. And I think those two reasons are partially why it's smaller and lighter as well as the aperture. So this one has a maximum aperture of f4, whereas this one, the maximum aperture is f2.8. So those three reasons are why this lens is smaller and lighter in comparison to this lens. And the diagonal angle of view on this one is 84 degrees at the widest and 27 degrees at the narrowest. And obviously the difference in the angle of view is relative to the focal length. So this one is 12-45, whereas this one is 12-40. So there's a difference there, obviously. The closest focusing distance on the 12-45 is 12 centimeters, whereas on this one is 20 centimeters. So there's a difference there in the closest focusing distance as well to keep in mind. So overall, I would say this one is smaller, lighter, no manual focus clutch, no lens function button, and less bright aperture. So it depends what you use it for. I don't really use the f2.8 aperture, and that's why you can see that this lens is attached to my camera, because this is the lens I use more, but simply because it's smaller and lighter and it has a longer reach at the telephoto end. But if you need a f2.8 and are willing to put up with a slightly bigger and heavier lens, then this lens is obviously more suitable. Another lens to compare this to is the Panasonic Lumix 12-35mm f2.8 Mark II. So there's a Mark III version of this lens as well, but I don't have that. So the Lumix lens weighs 305 grams, whereas this one is 382 grams. The Lumix lens is 7.38 centimeters, whereas this lens is 8.4 centimeters. The Lumix lens obviously doesn't have a manual focus clutch or lens function button, simply because the design of the Lumix lenses are different, and it's not weather sealed to the same degree that the M.Zuiko Pro lenses are. So it claims to be splash and dust resistant, but that's different to having an rating which proves that it's definitely weather resistance to a higher degree, which is the IP53 rating. The diagonal angle of view on this one is 84 degrees to 34 degrees, and obviously there's a difference in the focal length of these two lenses. So this is 12-35, whereas this one is 12-40. And the Lumix lens has optical stabilization, and that optical stabilization will work well with Panasonic cameras. Whereas if you have an Olympus body, then I wouldn't really consider the optical stabilization either a bonus or a disadvantage either way. So to summarize, the Panasonic Lumix lens is smaller and lighter, but it has a less telephoto reach, and it has optical stabilization, which would be good for Panasonic cameras, since Panasonic cameras don't have good in-body stabilization in comparison to Olympus cameras anyway. And one more factor to consider is that the zoom ring rotation direction is different between Olympus lenses and Panasonic lenses. So if you use the zoom ring for video work, then if you mix up which lenses you use in terms of Olympus lenses and Panasonic lenses, then you can't really use your muscle memory to zoom in or out, because you'll get it wrong. So I try to stick with all lenses that have the rotation in the same direction. So that's why I don't really use the Panasonic lens, and that's why you see the Panasonic lens in the box as opposed to it being out. So I don't really use the Panasonic zoom lens because of that reason. So that's just something to consider if you want to go for the Panasonic lens and you want to mix up the lenses that you have, Olympus and Panasonic. Although this doesn't really make a difference when you're talking about prime lenses, which are single focal length lenses, because then there is no zoom ring to worry about, and the focus ring, you can configure that in the camera which direction you want it to pull focus. Another lens to consider is the Olympus M.Zuiko Pro 8mm to 25mm f4, and this lens weighs 411 grams, whereas this one weighs 382 grams. This one is 8.85 centimeters when retracted, whereas this one is 8.4 centimeters when retracted. This one has a maximum aperture of f4, and this one has a maximum aperture of f2.8, and both of them keep that maximum aperture throughout the zoom range. And both of them have a minimum aperture of f22. The diagonal angle of view on this lens is 107 degrees at the widest and 47 degrees at the narrowest. So obviously there's a difference in the focal length of these two. So this is 8-25 and this one is 12-40, and hence the difference in the diagonal angle of view. The closest focusing distance on this lens is 23 centimeters, whereas it's 20 centimeters on this one. So to summarize the comparison between these two lenses, both of them are similar size, similar weight, similar features. The only real difference is that this one has a wider angle of view at 8mm versus this one, the widest being 12mm. And this one has a shorter telephoto range at 25mm, whereas 40mm on this one. So that's the main difference between them in terms of the focal range. But the 8-25mm has a locking problem. So in order to start using it, you have to extend the lens first, and then it clicks into place, and then you can use it. But this clicking into place seems to be a little bit dysfunctional, so it doesn't always click into place. So sometimes I have to zoom in and out 10-15 times before it eventually clicks into place. And that's not even the worst part. The worst part is sometimes when I'm recording video, because this design is dysfunctional, sometimes when I'm recording video and I zoom in and out, suddenly the video switches off and the camera says that the lens needs to be extended, even though the lens is actually extended. So the lens seems to misinterpret what's happening, or lever or whatever it is that needs to rotate seems to be faulty. So that's a problem with this lens. But apart from that, the 8 to 25mm focal range is a really good focal range to have for video recording. It's just that this locking mechanism that they've introduced on this lens, and this was the first lens which they introduced this mechanism on, is essentially a faulty design. So I hope they get rid of this type of design in the future, because it has actually made this lens dysfunctional. Even though this lens is really good in terms of the image quality, the locking mechanism essentially makes this lens useless in a lot of scenarios. Another lens to compare this to is the Olympus M.Zuiko 14 to 42mm f3.5 to f5.6 electronic zoom lens. And this lens obviously has a worse quality, but it does have some features which you might want to consider depending on what you want out of a lens. So this one weighs 93 grams, whereas this one is 382 grams, so 4 times heavier. And this one has a length of 2.25 centimeters when retracted, whereas this one is 8.4 centimeters. This one is not weather sealed, whereas this one is weather sealed with an IP53 rating. And this one doesn't have a manual focus clutch or lens function button, which this one has. But this one has an automatic lens cap. So when you turn on the camera, the lens cap is removed. And when you switch off the camera, the lens cap comes back on. So it's really convenient in that sense. And this lens has electronic zoom, which means you can operate it remotely from the mobile app. Or if you attach it to a PTZ camera, then you can operate it that way. Whereas this one has a manual mechanical zoom ring. So if you're doing handheld work, or if you're using the camera in your hand, even if it's on a tripod, then obviously this is a smoother zooming in and zooming out action. But if you're operating a PTZ camera, then the only option is to have electronic zoom, which this lens doesn't have. And the other difference between them is that this one has an aperture of f3.5 to f5.6, which is a variable aperture across the zoom range, whereas this one is f2.8, and that f2.8 is constant across the full zoom range. And both of them have a minimum aperture of f22. This one has 5 aperture blades, whereas the M.Zuiko Pro lens has 7 aperture blades. And what that means is that the bokeh from this lens will be more round and nicer looking, so you get better background blur. Whereas on this one, which has 5 aperture blades, the bokeh will have more edges. The diagonal angle of view on this one is 75 degrees at the widest and 29 degrees at the narrowest, which is obviously different to this one because of the focal length difference. So this is 12 to 40. This is 14 to 42. And the closest focusing distance on this one is 20 centimeters at the widest and 25 centimeters at the narrowest. And for this one is 20 centimeters. So to summarize the comparison between these two lenses, this one is not weather sealed. It has substantially lower image quality. It's not as wide, but it's smaller and lighter, and it has an automatic lens cap, and it has electronic zoom. So depending on what you're looking for, it might be the case that you just want something small and light, or maybe you want to use this lens for a PTZ camera, and that's why you want the electronic zoom. But obviously in terms of image quality and weather sealing and all other features, this lens is substantially better. Particularly the image quality is much better than the image quality on this one. Another lens to compare this to is a very similar lens to the previous one that I mentioned, but this doesn't have electronic zoom. So this is the Olympus M.Zuiko 14 to 42mm f3.5 to f5.6 Mark II-R. And this lens is almost identical to the previous lens that I mentioned. So it weighs 113 grams, whereas this one is 382 grams. It's 5 centimeters, whereas this one is 8.4 centimeters. It's not weather sealed. This one is weather sealed, and it has a rating of IP53. This one doesn't have a manual focus clutch, it doesn't have a lens function button, and its aperture is f3.5 to 5.6, which is a variable aperture, whereas this one has an f2.8 aperture, which is across the full focal range. And both of them have a minimum aperture of f22. The diagonal angle of view on this one is 75 degrees at the widest and 29 degrees at the narrowest. So obviously they have a different focal range. This is 14 to 42 and this is 12 to 40, hence the difference in the angle of view. And the closest focusing distance on this one is 25 centimeters at the widest and 30 centimeters at the narrowest or the telephoto end, whereas this one has the closest focusing distance of 20 centimeters. So again, this lens is not weather sealed, and it has lower image quality, and it's not as wide, so it's 14 millimeters versus 12 millimeters on this one, but it's substantially lighter and smaller and cheaper. So depending on what you're looking for, you might go for one of the alternatives to this lens. But if you're going for this lens, I would recommend that you go for the Olympus M.Zuiko 12 to 45mm instead, because that's a pro lens, so it has much better features, and that one is also light, so it's worth paying a little bit more to go for that lens as opposed to this one, which has a lower image quality. And also one of the things about this lens is that the zoom ring doesn't have a constant friction, so the movement is not uniform. You need to apply different levels of pressure depending on where in the focal range you are. So that's another reason why not to go for this lens. So when you buy this lens, you get the lens itself, which is the OM System M.Zuiko Pro 12-40mm F2.8 Mark II, or I don't know if I should call it Olympus or OM System, since the Mark II is OM System. You also get the lens hood for it, which is the OM System LH-66D. I hope that's visible in the video. And you get the front lens cap, which is the LC-62G. And you get the rear lens cap as well, which is LR-2. And you get the CS53 lens wrapping cloth, which is to protect the lens so that you carry it in a wrapping cloth. I don't know where I have mine at this moment in time. And there's also an instruction manual and a warranty card in the box. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions about this lens, or if you want me to compare it to any other lens or provide sample footage for it.